The issue that would define the United Church of Canada. There was a desire for the Methodists, Congregationalists, and most Presbyterians to come together in union in 1925. There were difficulties when a portion of the Presbyterian Church chose to remain separate from others who had joined the United Church of Canada. The United Church structure affords a great deal of latitude to churches at the local level to live out their faith and worship. There was a sense of, I'm okay and you're okay, even if we disagree. The issue that would be seen as the issue that would forever define the United Church of Canada were then changes to operations and policies with regards to homosexuals. This is a journey of how we, as members, came to celebrate diversity in sexual orientation. But not everyone is celebrating, but we are moving forwards and towards inclusion. We will look at the beginnings of our church, review hurdles and obstacles, identify some of the steps that brought us to where we are today, understand and appreciate the opposition and the consequences of decisions made, reflect on the ability to remain united, and finally, consider the opportunities to learn from our history, opportunities for future inclusion. At the time of its inception, in 1925, the United Church of Canada considered homosexuality a sin, and openly LGBTQ people would not be considered for candidates for ministry, along with their counterparts, women. In the mid-1930s, the hot topic was the Ordination of Women, a controversy that had been inherited from the founding churches. The debates were pretty darn fierce. The liberals within the congregations quoted scriptures that showed that there should be no differentiation between male and female in Christianity. However, the conservatives quoted the scripture about women keeping quiet in church and not taking positions of leadership. There was fear that these debates would split the church. Centuries of tradition were cited. Tempers ran high. And finally, formal sexism in the church came to an end when Lydia Grouchy was ordained as their first female minister in 1936. Surprisingly, the church survived and grew. Many churches across Canada had groups that met on a regular basis to support and encourage one another as they faced discrimination within and outside the church community. In 1972, the church's General Council commissioned a comprehensive study on human sexuality. And in 1980, a task force on sexuality presented its report, In God's Image, Male and Female. It covered sexuality, selfhood, marriage, intimacy, sexism in society, and sexual orientation. In conclusion, it said in principle that there was no reason to exclude self-accepting, mature homosexuals from becoming ordained or commissioned. The General Council called for more studies. The use of inclusive language was introduced in the 28th General Council in 1980. A motion was passed committing the church to eliminating male words in church publications. These would include hymn books, the manual, service book, the new creed, and Christian education resources and other divisional materials. The conservatives in this church, though, saw these changes as moving towards radical feminism. The church took a position to be inclusive, but the conservatives felt it opened the door to feminizing God. Scripture portrayed God as male, and these changes would erode church doctrine. They would not argue that women are children of God, but they didn't feel it was necessary to change any words that were gender-based. Many years later, this continues to be an issue, but more people have a greater appreciation for the value of gender-inclusive terms. This has honored all people by allowing them to identify what pronouns they want to be connected with. In 1982, gay and lesbian support groups from within the United Church of Canada and across the country came together in Montreal for a conference to develop an organization to effectively advocate for their full inclusion in church activities and roles. Many conservative church members were vehemently opposed to the ordination of homosexuals, and over the next 4 years, membership in the United Church of Canada fell by 78,184. In some cases, congregations split, with a sizable faction, sometimes led by the minister, and leaving to form an independent church. In some cases, entire congregations elected to leave the church, some of them joining with other Presbyterian denominations that had originally not joined union. In 1982, representatives of homosexual groups across Canada formed AFFIRM, a mutual support group of United Church homosexual members. The church established a task group to study the sexual orientation and ministry. They received input from the newly created AFFIRM group, but they also listened to the United Church Renewal Fellowship, a conservative group which was formed in 1966 to promise a return to traditional values within the church. At the General Council in 1984, a motion was presented to recognize 2 members of AFFIRM as non-voting corresponding members. It was narrowly defeated and triggered the creation of a new group within the United Church called Friends of AFFIRM. The council decided to postpone a decision on the issue until subsequent meeting, which was in 1988. The National Coordinating Group for the Program of Study and Dialogue on Sexual Orientations, Lifestyles, and Ministry was created. The UCRF prepared an article entitled Healing for the Homosexual, Healing for the Church, which argued that the solution to the issue was to convert the homosexuals to heterosexuality. In advance of the next General Council, a special committee of 24 members was convened to digest the report and make recommendations. Marion Best, who chaired the committee, recalled that when they began, there were only 2 members who supported the report, and 5 opposed. The rest were open to listening. On day 2 of the deliberations, the committee members arrived at the classroom they were meeting in and found homophobic slurs written all over the blackboard. Best describes that moment as a critical turning point. After 6 days of grueling debate and soul-searching, the members decided to recommend the report unanimously. United Church General Council executives met for 5 days at the end of November in Toronto to decide how to move forward. This emergency meeting was precipitated by the demands for a binding referendum on the issue by 1,000 Community of Concern members who had assembled in Etobicoke. They told the executive, "We're here for the long haul." A task force released Gift, Dilemma, and Promise, a report and affirmation of human sexuality. In this, it stated that all human beings, regardless of their sexual orientation, are persons made in the image of God, and recommended that the church welcome sexually active gay men and women and bisexuals into every aspect of the church, which included ministry. A poll was taken within the church, and revealed that only 28% of the members supported this concept, and the conservative factions vowed that they would defeat the proposal and would be tabled at the 32nd General Council that year. That unanimous decision was a powerful symbol to the General Council. For 9 days at a university in Victoria, delegates lobbied and debated this divisive issue. After 7 hours, at 1 o'clock on August 24th, there was a vote, and 388 delegates voted in favor of any worshiper, including self-declared homosexuals, to be full members of the church, which meant that anyone could be eligible for ministry. On this day, the United Church of Canada voted to ordain homosexuals. There's a clip, if you choose to watch it, from the CBC The National, which is a historical day in Canadian history when this occurred. What were the factors that indeed impacted the decisions and changed the hearts and minds of those who were voting? Perhaps part of it was hearing the testimony of other people within the church who indeed were gay, but also loved and desired to serve God. There was definitely tension in the air. It was a heated debate between those who found no reason why homosexuals could not participate in ministry. A conservative group from within the United Church of Canada felt that they would be compromising on scriptural foundations if indeed homosexuals were ordained. There was also a fundamentalist evangelical group that came from the United States and created a ruckus at the General Council meeting and had to be ejected from their abusive language towards homosexuals. Perhaps seeing the hatred that came from the fundamental evangelicals, perhaps it touched the hearts of some of the members, and they decided that perhaps that was not a loving thing to do. So was the decision a miracle, a move of the Spirit, compassion? It was a strange event that the majority of the delegates who had come to the council had a bias against ordaining homosexuals. But with an open mind, they heard the heart of the wrenching testimonies of devout gay and lesbian church members, and many delegates had probably never met an openly homosexual person, and this had been the first time in their life. They debated little else among themselves, and they searched their hearts and prayed to learn God's will, and most changed their minds. The declaration that all persons, regardless of their sexual orientation, who profess Jesus Christ and obedience to Him, are welcome to be or become full members of the United Church, and that all members of the church are eligible to be considered for ordained ministry. The resolution was amended that all Christian people are called to a lifestyle patterned on obedience to Jesus Christ. Another resolution was passed that called for more discussion and examination of the issue and to urge the church to fight discrimination against homosexuals in and beyond the church walls. Indeed, there was opposition to this decision in mass proportion. There were some who were just adamantly against the whole concept of homosexuality as being a normative state. There was a media frenzy on this topic, the issue that the United Church of Canada had voted for homosexuals to be able to be ordained. And the Observer responded to this, saying that 85% of the feedback that they received was negative. 1988, many hundreds of local discussion groups had debated the issue. About 90% of their reports were opposed to ordaining non-heterosexuals. The National Coordinating Group issued its final report in early 1988. They deviated from a clear message sent by the local groups by recommending that gay and lesbians be considered for ordination. The reaction by members and their congregations was explosive, and a conservative community of concern was organized to oppose the report. They issued a declaration of dissent. A poll taken by the church revealed that only 28% of its membership favored the admission of active homosexuals into ministry. The Community of Concern, which was a grassroots lobby group that sprang out of Calgary, said they were going to fight the report's recommendations to ordain homosexuals. And on March 29, 1988, the leaders gathered to debate and discuss this issue. At a regional meeting in Camrose that May, petitions were brought forward rejecting the report and expressing absolute opposition. The Northwest Conference in Alberta expressed concern that people were considering leaving the church if the report was accepted. By the time of the 32nd General Council meeting in Victoria in August 88, the church had received 1,813 petitions from across Canada rejecting the report. Dissent was increasing all across the country and led predominantly by the Community of Concern movement. Calgary had started its own chapter of anti-gay lobby group in October, and by November, the Hillhurst United Church had publicly declared that it was withholding funds from the national church and encouraged other congregations to join them. Later that month, 3 other churches indeed did. In September 1988, there was a fallout in Lethbridge First United Church. At a congregational meeting, they voted 4-1 to break away from the United Church due to the General Council's decision. 1 hour north of Calgary, in Cremona, United Church draped its signpost in sackcloth and ashes as a symbol of mourning. The church said, as they erected a large sign on the church grounds, said, "This church is opposed to ordaining homosexuals." Calgary's Hillhurst United Church was not pleased with the decision. Their Reverend Robert Nagus said, "It's wrong. It's an error in judgment. It's an attempt to sanctify sin. But the way to fight this thing is to stay with the church and get a referendum and change the policy." Ordination of women had been a very hot topic for this new church, but half a century later, quotations from the Bible were cited again, and fears of a split of the church once again arose. This time, the topic was homosexuality. The General Council of the United Church of Canada in 1988 decided to stop barring openly gay and lesbian people from ministry. This challenged so many who had called the United Church of Canada their denomination. In 1992, Tim Stevenson became the first openly gay man to be ordained as a minister in the United Church of Canada. Those who represent the conservative faction of the United Church do not think that their voices were heard, as at one point they resonated with the majority. I believe that the General Council was wise not to call for another vote, but just to wait for the next meeting of the General Council. Just as we all come with our bias and prejudice, we are blind to the experience of the minority. Only when people on the council and who were delegates at the General Council did they see the kind of alienation and hate gay and lesbians experience. They also experienced gay and lesbians as siblings in the faith, passionate about serving God. If we only listen to the group with the loudest voice, or the greatest number of voices, we will never be like Christ, who cared deeply about the people who had no power, struggled with their identity in a community, and needed desperately for someone to see their inherent value as people. Active church-going has declined in the country generally. Polls show that only 20% of the adult population say that they regularly attend church, and the reality of that situation could be worse because regularly can sometimes mean once or twice a year. It's difficult to determine how much of the decline is after 1988 was due to the issue. Some congregations have left the United Church, others have split. The Community of Concern and Church Alive and the National Association of Covenanting Congregations and the United Church Renewal Fellowship have criticized the headquarters staff for pushing through this radical legislation through council and stifling the freedom of speech. When free speech, though, becomes destructive, it's no longer a right. However, some ministers and congregations remain within the United Church of Canada and have the freedom not to call a minister that was considered gay, or one that might support a gay lifestyle, and each congregation can determine their own marriage policy. This is a hard concept to understand, that United Church fights against discrimination, yet at the congregational level, the national policies don't have to be implemented. In response to the long-time relationships of gay and lesbian couples and the inability to be civilly married, the United Church created covenanting services in which they made resources available to individual congregations called Together in Faith. It invited congregations to consider becoming an inclusive faith community that welcomes people of all sexual orientation. The covenanting services allowed couples to make a commitment to each other in the sight of God and their faith community, but not all United Churches of Canada made covenanting services available. At the 41st United Church of Canada's General Council meeting in Ottawa, Reverend Dr. Gary Patterson was elected as the moderator for United Church of Canada. He is married to the first gay man who was ordained with the United Church of Canada, and they had been partners for over 40 years. During a news conference after his election, he made this comment in reference to his sexual orientation. What some denominations or some parts of the world see as a huge dilemma and a problem has not, within our immediate community, been seen that way at all. As amazing as it was that the United Church of Canada would indeed have a gay moderator, it is not always the experience of all members of the United Church to have the acceptance within their church community. In 1999, the representative of the church appeared before the Parliament Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights to speak in favor of a bill that extended survivor pension rights to same-sex couples on the same basis as those in heterosexual relationships. Not everyone wishes to be legally married, but for those who do, this was a huge step forward for the equity of the gay and lesbian community. After a significant amount of advocacy by the United Church of Canada and other groups, in 2005, the Federal Civil Marriage Act came into force. And all people would be able to be married, regardless of their sexual orientation. In 2000, the 37th Council resolved to support the civil recognition of same-sex partnerships. And in 2003, at the 37th Council, the commissioners affirmed that human sexual orientations, whether heterosexual or homosexual, are a gift from God and a part of the marvelous diversity of creation. So, on July 20th, 2005, Canada made amendments to the Federal Civil Marriage Act, making same-sex marriage legal across Canada. Moderator Peter Short was quoted in national newspapers regarding that 17 years after the division caused by the issue of gay ordination, that same-sex marriage issue again will divide liberal congregations, some willing to consecrate same-sex weddings from those who did not. This does cause a problem that more members would choose to step away from the United Church of Canada. Although that there are many United Church congregations that now allow same-sex marriage to take place in their sanctuaries, that there are many who do not. Nevertheless, the things that divide the church appear to be healing as acceptance of gay ordination and same-sex marriage become more widespread throughout the entire country. The United Church Renewal Fellowship and the National Alliance of Covenanting Congregations have seen their membership decline since 2000, with the latter now only claiming 75 of the United Churches that was more than 2,000 congregations in its membership. The United Church Renewal Fellowship had begun as a response to what it saw was a growing rebellion in society and in the church. Some individuals felt they needed to engage with denominations that were more conservative. Some members, like Cummings, felt that the church needed to promote the concept that the church was the body of Christ and needed to be more spiritually nurtured, receiving spiritual and scriptural teaching and mentoring. The way forward was for the church to influence the culture and not let the culture influence the church. Affirm United was formed to support individual lesbian and gay members of the United Church of Canada and to advocate within the church for their full inclusion. This started in 1982, and they continue to work for the inclusion, but not only of lesbian and gay members, but people who are also marginalized and need acceptance within the church. Affirm United provides resources and supports to local churches, colleges, camp ministries, and assisted living homes. Through their support and materials, groups can study and reflect and discuss issues that relate to gender identities and expression and sexual orientations. They are invited to become a welcoming community by making policy changes, environmental changes, and commit themselves to the work for justice and inclusion in their faith community and the wider community. Currently, the United Church encourages ministries to participate. Over 100 ministries are going through the affirming process, and 200 ministries and communities have already become affirming communities. Several of the churches that initially were in opposition to the ordination of gay and lesbian members are now affirming communities. I appreciate how Affirm United calls the process a transformation, that each person and community must decide for themselves. Affirm provides the tools and resources for people to explore if, how, and why they may choose to become an affirming ministry. The process does not have a defined time frame. it takes as long as it takes, and for some communities, they decide that they're not ready to proceed. As much as I long for our churches to stand united, believing and affirming and being anti-racist and wanting to bring reconciliation, it has to be a personal decision. In speaking with Peggy Rideout about her involvement with Affirm as an ally, she shared how difficult it was to see so many congregations in opposition and the hurt that was experienced by gays and lesbians and transsexuals in our community. Out of 11 people who strongly were opposed to gay ordination and to same-sex marriage, she reports that 10 out of 11 have become supportive and engaged in the affirming process. Peggy Rideout shared this chart and explained that although it initially was developed for adopters of technology, it is actually a good model to understand change and the adoption of ideas within the church. Innovators are defined as the first 2.5% of people to adopt a new idea. And then there are early adopters, which make up 13%, and so forth. So when we discuss the future of the church and the congregation embracing change, and whether there would be greater acceptance for LGBTQ plus and other marginalized groups, she shared this chart with me. There are few innovators, and most people fall within the early adopters or late majority. Early adopters are influenced by respect from opinion leaders in their community and adopt new ideas early but carefully. The early majority acts deliberately, usually with education and knowing the impact of the idea. They rarely will adopt ideas before the average person. The late majority have skeptic attitudes, which adopt an innovation only after most people have tried it. Peggy indicates that this group is not persuaded by education or highly influential people, but moved to adopt ideas, beliefs, and actions based on a personal and relational connection with someone they trust. Laggards are people who are tradition-bound and they look for change with suspicion and adopt innovation only when it actually has become a tradition itself. So that is why programs like Affirm United are important. Not only do they provide education, but it allows for people to digest the information together, making meaning and sense for themselves. Perhaps, as we address some of the fallout of our history as a church, we will truly seek reconciliation with all people. There are great lessons to be learned from history. Perhaps the greatest is we need to honor each other's stories. We cannot possibly journey together when we don't respect and care for one another. Perhaps the bridge going forward is Turtle Island. As we listen to our Indigenous siblings, we can begin to appreciate what everyone brings to the round table. I was truly touched by the affirmation statement made by an Indigenous group of people at the Ralph Connor Memorial Church, which has truly become a place of inclusion and healing. Every tribe and every nation is one under God, uniquely fashioned in the Creator's image. Diversity is a gift from God. This is the statement of ministry of inclusion. In the same way that Jesus reached out to and welcomed all people, our faith community is called to be open and inclusive. We continue to seek ways to be inclusive of all people in Bow Valley, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, age, cultural background, education level, or mobility challenges. All people are welcome. My hope is that as we go forward as the United Church of Canada, that each congregation, every faith community, will come to embrace and accept those of every color, every creed, every nation, every gender, every orientation, that we will see that together we are the beautiful creation of God.